I never imagined that a single moment could rewrite everything I thought I knew about my life, stripping away all the mundane routines and replacing them with something raw and terrifying. The fire alarm's shrill wail cut through the museum like a blade, triggering an instant eruption of panic that transformed the elegant third-floor gallery into a stampede of screaming tourists and frantic staff members. I was just a part-time security guard working my way through college, earning barely enough to cover textbooks and ramen noodles. But that afternoon taught me that destiny doesn't care about your resume or your bank account. The protocol was simple. Evacuate everyone, check the floors, get out. I was following orders, herding people toward the emergency stairs, when I heard it. A sound so faint and broken that it almost disappeared beneath the chaos, like the whimper of something small and wounded. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to follow everyone else down those stairs and into safety. But something deeper, something I couldn't name, made me stop. The restoration room door was slightly ajar, and smoke was beginning to curl through the crack like ghostly fingers reaching for something precious. I pushed it open and immediately started coughing as the acrid air hit my lungs. The heat was building, flames were climbing the walls below us, and I knew I had maybe 2 minutes before this entire section became an inferno. That's when I saw him. A boy, no older than 7, was curled into the tightest ball imaginable in the corner behind a storage cabinet. He wore a burgundy sweater vest over a white collared shirt, looking like he'd just stepped out of a private school portrait, but his face was contorted in silent agony. His small hands were clamped over his ears so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and his whole body was convulsing with tremors that looked almost violent. His eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks, and he was completely unresponsive to my presence. I dropped to my knees beside him, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hey, we need to go right now," I said, trying to sound calm even though every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. It was like he'd retreated so far inside himself that the outside world had ceased to exist. The smoke was getting thicker, and I could hear the ominous crackle of flames getting closer. I didn't have time to coax him out gently, didn't have time to figure out what was wrong or how to communicate with him properly. So I made a decision that would change everything. I yanked off my security jacket, wrapped it around his head and shoulders to protect him from the smoke, and lifted him into my arms. He was surprisingly light, fragile in a way that made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar protectiveness. The journey down those stairs was the longest of my life. The smoke was so dense that I could barely see 3 feet ahead, and I had to feel my way along the wall with one hand while clutching this trembling child against my chest with the other. He was still crying, still shaking, his small fingers clutching my shirt so desperately that I could feel his nails through the fabric. I kept talking to him, saying anything that came to mind. "We're almost there. You're safe. I've got you. Just hold on." My lungs were burning, my eyes were streaming, and I was starting to feel dizzy from the smoke inhalation when we finally burst through the emergency exit into the parking lot. The fresh air hit me like a physical force, and I immediately dropped to my knees on the pavement, still holding the boy. Paramedics swarmed us within seconds, placing oxygen masks over both our faces, but I refused to let go of him until I was absolutely certain he was okay. That's when I heard the voice, desperate, broken, terrified beyond measure. "Allan, where's Allan?" A man was running toward us, his expensive 3-piece suit streaked with soot, his gray eyes wild with panic that bordered on hysteria. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and the kind of presence that usually commanded rooms, but right now he just looked like any father who thought he'd lost his child forever. The boy, Allan, suddenly came alive at the sound of that voice. He pulled away from me and stumbled toward the man, who caught him and dropped to his knees, wrapping him in an embrace so tight and desperate that I had to look away from the raw intimacy of it. The man was crying, openly and without shame, pressing kisses to the top of Allan's head and saying his name over and over like a prayer. Then he looked at me. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that look changed something fundamental in the air between us. It wasn't just gratitude or relief, it was something deeper, something almost reverential. His gray eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me forget about the smoke still irritating my lungs, about the paramedics trying to check my vitals, about everything except the connection that seemed to snap into place between us in that moment. He stood up slowly, still holding Allan against his hip, and walked over to me. Without warning or hesitation, he reached out and cupped my face with his free hand, his palm warm and slightly trembling against my cheek. "You saved my son," he said, his voice hoarse and breaking on every word. "I don't know who you are, but you just gave me back everything that matters." I was too stunned to respond properly, could only manage an awkward nod while my brain tried to process what was happening. He was still touching my face, still looking at me like I was something miraculous and impossible. "I'm sorry," he said, finally pulling his hand back and seeming to realize how strange his behavior must seem. "I'm Dawson. Dawson Quentin." The name hit me like a physical blow. Dawson Quentin, the real estate developer whose face appeared on billboards all over the city. The man whose company owned half the luxury properties downtown. The billionaire whose personal life was constantly dissected in business magazines. And here he was, standing in front of me with tears on his face and his son clutching his neck, looking at me like I was the most important person in the world. "Mitch," I managed to say. "Mitch Brennan. Mitch Brennan," he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. "I will never forget this. Never forget you." Allan had turned his face toward me, his green eyes still wet with tears, and he gave me the smallest, most heartbreaking smile I'd ever seen. In that moment, watching the two of them together, this powerful man reduced to gratitude and vulnerability, this fragile child who'd somehow survived his own terror, I felt something shift inside me, like a door I didn't know existed had just been opened, revealing a path I'd never considered walking before. The week following the fire felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream where nothing quite made sense anymore. The museum remained closed for extensive repairs, which meant my part-time paycheck disappeared along with the charred exhibition hall. I spent most of my days in the university library, trying to focus on my art history assignments, while my mind kept drifting back to that afternoon. The smoke, the fear, the weight of that small body in my arms, and most of all the way Dawson Quentin had looked at me like I'd performed a miracle. I'd convinced myself that the incident would fade into memory, becoming nothing more than an interesting story to tell at parties. Life would return to normal. I'd find another part-time job, finish my degree, maybe eventually land a position at a small gallery somewhere. The universe had other plans. My phone buzzed during a particularly dull lecture on Renaissance symbolism. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me step out into the hallway and answer. The voice on the other end was professional, polished, clearly belonging to someone who was used to efficiency and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Is this Mitch Brennan? This is Eleanor Chen, Mr. Quentin's personal assistant. He would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Are you available this afternoon?" I stood there in the empty hallway, students passing by on either side, and felt my carefully constructed sense of normalcy begin to crumble. Yes? I mean, what is this about? "Mr. Quentin will explain everything when you arrive. I'll text you the address. Would 2 o'clock work for you?" 3 hours later, I found myself standing in front of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves, feeling completely out of place in my thrift store button-down and worn jeans. The lobby alone was more expensive than my entire apartment. All marble and steel and intimidating modern art that probably cost more than my college tuition. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending into another world entirely. When the doors opened, Eleanor Chen herself, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and a no-nonsense expression, escorted me down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered dizzying views of the city below. She knocked once on a door at the end of the hall, then opened it without waiting for a response. Dawson stood with his back to us, staring out at the cityscape. He was in a different suit than the one I'd seen him in before, this one navy blue and clearly tailored to perfection, but there was something about his posture that seemed less commanding than I would have expected. When he turned around, I saw why. His eyes held the same vulnerability I'd seen in the parking lot, that raw honesty that seemed completely at odds with his surroundings. "Mitch," he said, and there was genuine warmth in the way he said my name. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." I lowered myself into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. But instead of sitting behind it like I expected, he took the chair next to mine. The gesture felt deliberate, like he was actively trying to remove the power imbalance between us. "I've been trying to find the right words all week," he began, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that made him seem almost boyish despite his age. "How do you thank someone for giving you back your whole world?" "You already did," I said, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of his gratitude. "In the parking lot. It's okay. Really. Anyone would have—" "No." His voice was firm, cutting through my deflection. "They wouldn't have. Everyone else ran. You went back." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken things. Finally Dawson leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and I could see how much this conversation was costing him. "I need to tell you something about Allan. About why he was in that room. Why he couldn't move." He explained then, in careful detail, about Allan's diagnosis, severe sensory processing disorder that made him extraordinarily sensitive to certain stimuli. Loud noises, especially unexpected ones like fire alarms, could send him into complete shutdowns where he lost all ability to function or respond. The world became too much, too fast, too overwhelming, and his only defense was to curl up and try to make it all disappear. His therapist has been working with him for years. Dawson continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We've tried everything. Exposure therapy, noise-canceling headphones, medication. Nothing works perfectly. That day at the museum, we'd gone to see the dinosaur exhibit because Allan loves paleontology, and I thought it would be good for him. Then the alarm went off, and he just vanished into himself. By the time I realized he wasn't with me, the crowd had already swept me outside." The guilt in his voice was crushing. I found myself wanting to reach out, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But I stayed still and let him continue. "Every night since then, Allan talks about you. The person who smelled like coffee and cinnamon and made the scary noise go away. The guardian who carried him to safety. You've become something almost mythical to him, proof that the world isn't always terrifying, that sometimes help comes when you need it most." Dawson stood up and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the bright afternoon sky. "His mother left us 2 years ago, said she couldn't handle raising a child with special needs, that it wasn't what she signed up for. So it's just been the two of us, and I've been trying so hard to be enough, but I don't think I am. Allan doesn't connect with people easily. He doesn't trust new faces, but he trusts you." He turned back to face me, and the proposition in his eyes was clear before he even spoke. "I want to hire you to spend time with Allan, not as a therapist or a medical professional. He has those, not as a nanny or a babysitter. That's not what this is. I want you to be his companion, someone who helps him feel safe in a world that usually feels hostile." My mouth went dry. "Mr. Quentin, I'm just a college student. I'm studying art history, not child development. I don't have any qualifications for this." "I don't need qualifications," Dawson said, and there was steel beneath the vulnerability now. "I need genuine care. I need someone Allan already feels connected to. Everything else is secondary." He named a figure then, what he'd pay me monthly, and I actually felt dizzy. It was more than I made in 6 months at the museum, more than I'd ever imagined earning while still in school. "Why me?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "You could hire anyone, professionals, experts, people who actually know what they're doing." Dawson moved closer. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "Because when Allan woke up from nightmares every night this week, crying about the fire, the only thing that calmed him down was talking about you. Because in 7 years, I've never seen him smile at a stranger the way he smiled at you in that parking lot. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't expertise, it's connection." He pulled a business card from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. His fingers lingered against mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "Think about it. Take all the time you need. But please, consider that you might be exactly what Allan needs, even if you don't believe it yourself." As I left his office and rode the elevator back down to street level, I stared at the card in my hand. His personal cell number was handwritten on the back. That night, I lay awake in my cramped apartment, thinking about a little boy who was scared of fire alarms, and a father who looked at me like I held all the answers. 3 days later, my hand shaking only slightly, I called the number and said yes. The first time I walked into Dawson's penthouse, I felt like an astronaut stepping onto an alien planet. Everything was beautiful and intimidating and so far removed from my reality that I couldn't quite believe I was allowed to be there. The elevator opened directly into the foyer, which was decorated with minimalist elegance that probably required a team of interior designers and a budget I couldn't even conceptualize. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a 360-degree view of the city that made me feel like I was floating above the world rather than living in it. Dawson greeted me at the elevator and I was surprised to see him in casual clothes. Dark jeans and a gray sweater that made his eyes look almost silver in the afternoon light. It was the first time I'd seen him looking like an actual person rather than a business magazine cover. And somehow it made him even more intimidating because it reminded me that behind the wealth and power was just a man trying to navigate fatherhood alone. "Thanks for coming," he said, genuine relief coloring his voice. "Allan's been counting down the hours since I told him you were visiting." He led me through the living room, which managed to be both spacious and somehow cozy despite its size, and down a hallway decorated with black and white photographs that I wanted to stop and examine but didn't quite have the courage to do so. We stopped outside a door covered in colorful dinosaur stickers, and Dawson knocked gently before pushing it open. Allan's room was a stark contrast to the rest of the apartment. Where everything else was sleek and modern and carefully curated, this space was unmistakably a child's domain. Dinosaur posters covered the walls in organized chaos. Shelves were filled with toys arranged in meticulous rows, organized by size and color, and in the corner sat a pile of weighted blankets that I recognized from my hasty research into sensory processing disorder. Natural light flooded through sheer curtains, soft and diffused rather than harsh. Allan was sitting cross-legged on his bed, completely absorbed in building an elaborate structure out of colorful blocks. The pattern he was creating was geometric and precise, showing a level of spatial reasoning that seemed advanced for his age. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his entire face transformed with joy so pure and uninhibited that it made my chest ache. "You're the coffee smell person," he exclaimed, abandoning his blocks immediately and sliding off the bed. He stopped a few feet away from me, suddenly shy, and I realized he was waiting for permission to come closer. I knelt down to his level, making myself less imposing. "I am. And you're Allan, the bravest kid I've ever met." He tilted his head, considering this. "I wasn't brave. I was scared." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," I said gently. "It means you keep going even when you are. And you did, you held on to me and got through it." This seemed to satisfy him because he finally closed the distance between us and wrapped his small arms around my neck in a hug that was both tentative and trusting. Over his shoulder I saw Dawson standing in the doorway watching us with an expression so complex I couldn't begin to decode it. Gratitude certainly, but also something that looked almost like longing. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Allan showed me his entire block collection, explaining the properties of each shape with the seriousness of a professor delivering a lecture. We built towers and bridges, tested which structures could withstand the most weight, and I found myself genuinely fascinated by the way his mind worked. He saw patterns and possibilities that I would have missed, approaching each problem with methodical creativity. Dawson checked on us periodically, always hovering in the doorway rather than entering fully, and each time our eyes met across the room, I felt that strange electricity I'd experienced in the parking lot. It was like we were both holding our breath, waiting to see if this fragile new arrangement would work or shatter. When dinner time arrived, Allan insisted I stay and eat with them. We gathered around the dining table, which felt absurdly large for just 3 people, and ate simple pasta that Dawson admitted he'd ordered from a nearby Italian restaurant because cooking wasn't his strong suit. Allan dominated the conversation, telling me about his favorite television show, apparently featuring a detective octopus who solved underwater mysteries, and I found myself laughing more genuinely than I had in months. Dawson remained mostly quiet throughout the meal, contributing occasionally when Allan asked him direct questions, but mostly he just observed. I could feel his attention on me even when I wasn't looking at him, and it made me hyper-aware of every move I made, every word I spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was definitely intense, like being studied by someone who needed to memorize every detail. After dinner, Allan's energy began to wane. The stimulation of having a visitor, combined with the emotional exhaustion of trying to communicate and connect, was clearly taking its toll. When he started rubbing his eyes and leaning against my side, Dawson gently suggested it was time for him to get ready for bed. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Allan asked me, his voice small and vulnerable in a way that made my throat tight. I looked at Dawson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'll come back," I promised. "We can build something even bigger next time." Allan's smile was worth every moment of uncertainty I'd felt about accepting this job. He hugged me again, this time with more confidence, and whispered, "Thank you for saving me from the fire." After Dawson walked Allan to his room for bedtime routines, I found myself alone in the hallway, suddenly unsure what I was supposed to do. Should I leave? Wait. The apartment was quiet, except for the muffled sound of Dawson's voice reading a bedtime story in the distance, and I felt like an intruder in this intimate evening ritual. When Dawson finally emerged, he looked exhausted but peaceful. He found me still standing awkwardly by the elevator, and something in his expression softened. "Walk with me for a minute." We ended up in the living room, standing by those massive windows as the city lights began to twinkle below us like terrestrial stars. The silence between us felt charged with unspoken things, questions neither of us quite knew how to ask. "He hasn't hugged anyone besides me in over 2 years," Dawson finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not his therapist, who he's known since he was 4. Not his teacher, who's patient and kind and everything a teacher should be. Not even his grandmother, who visits every month and brings him presents and tries so hard to connect with him. Nobody." He turned to face me fully, and in the dim light, his gray eyes looked almost haunted. "Whatever you're doing, whatever instinct or kindness or magic you possess, please don't stop. He needs this connection. He needs to know that the world has people in it who will choose to help rather than run away. And He paused, seeming to struggle with vulnerability. "I need to know that I'm not failing him by being the only person he can rely on." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest. I wanted to tell him that he wasn't failing, that Allan was clearly loved and cared for in ways that mattered more than any diagnosis or limitation. But the words felt inadequate, so instead I just said, "I'll be here for as long as he needs me." Dawson's hand briefly touched my shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that lasted only seconds but somehow felt significant. "Thank you, Mitch. Truly." As I rode the elevator back down to ground level and walked out into the cool evening air, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my life. I'd walked into that penthouse as a struggling college student doing someone a favor, but I was leaving as something more, a person who mattered, who was needed, who had somehow become essential to 2 people I'd known for less than 2 weeks. The weight of that responsibility should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like purpose, like maybe for the first time in my aimless life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 2 months dissolved into each other so seamlessly that I stopped noticing when Dawson's penthouse transformed from an intimidating fortress into something that felt dangerously close to home. My visits became routine every other afternoon. After my classes ended, I'd take the train across town and ride that elevator up to a world that shouldn't have fit me but somehow did. Allan and I developed our own rituals that existed outside the boundaries of what I'd originally imagined this job would be. We spent entire afternoons at the Natural History Museum, where Allan would stand transfixed before the dinosaur exhibits, reciting facts about Cretaceous period predators with the passionate precision of a seasoned paleontologist. He'd memorize bone structures and dietary habits, then quiz me on the ride home, his face lighting up with pride whenever I remembered something he'd taught me the previous week. Other days we'd stay in, spreading newspapers across the kitchen floor while we mixed paints, discovering that blue and yellow created green in infinite variations depending on the ratio. Allan approached color theory like it was a science experiment, documenting his findings in a spiral notebook with careful annotations. Sometimes we'd simply exist together on the balcony, watching clouds drift across the sky, while inventing stories about their shapes. A cumulus formation would become a dragon hoarding treasure. A wispy cirrus would transform into a ghost searching for its lost family. Allan's imagination, once locked behind walls of anxiety and fear, was blooming into something extraordinary, and I felt privileged to witness it. But the real transformation I observed wasn't in Allan. It was in Dawson, the man who'd initially maintained careful professional distance, who'd hovered in doorways without fully entering rooms, gradually began inserting himself into our afternoons. He started coming home earlier, trading boardroom meetings for dinner-table conversations. His assistant Eleanor would call with increasingly urgent messages about rescheduled appointments, but Dawson would just smile and tell her the investors could wait. We became an accidental family, the three of us navigating evenings with the tentative choreography of people learning to share space. Allan would set the table with meticulous care, ensuring each fork and knife aligned perfectly. Dawson would attempt cooking with varying degrees of success, and I'd offer commentary that made them both laugh. These weren't the polished, performative family dinners I'd seen in movies. They were messy and imperfect and somehow more real because of it. One particular evening shifted something fundamental between Dawson and me. Allan had exhausted himself at the neighborhood park, where he'd conquered his fear of the swings for the first time, pumping his legs with determination until he was soaring high enough to make my heart leap into my throat. By 8 o'clock he was already asleep, curled under his weighted blanket with his favorite dinosaur plushie clutched against his chest. I'd settled on the living room couch with my laptop, struggling through an essay about Baroque architectural influences while the city glittered below like a field of terrestrial stars. Dawson emerged from his home office, carrying 2 wine glasses and a bottle I suspected cost more than my monthly rent. He sat beside me, not at the other end of the couch where there was plenty of room, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Everything here feels different now," he said quietly, staring into his wine as if searching for words at the bottom of the glass. "Allan smiles more. He laughs more. His nightmares have decreased by 70% according to the sleep monitor. But more than that, I don't feel like I'm drowning anymore. Like maybe I'm actually succeeding at this impossible task of being both mother and father to a child who needs more than I thought I could give." I closed my laptop, recognizing that this moment required my full attention. "You're an incredible father, Dawson. Anyone can see that Allan adores you." His laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like broken glass. "I'm terrified every single day, second-guessing every decision, wondering if I'm doing irreparable damage because I don't have the instruction manual his mother threw away when she walked out. She looked at our beautiful boy and called him defective, used that exact word like he was a product she could return for a refund. The pain in his voice was so raw that I instinctively reached out, placing my hand over his where it rested on his knee. "She's wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong. Allan isn't defective. He's exceptional. He sees patterns and connections that most people miss. His brain works differently, not worse." Dawson turned to face me fully, and suddenly the space between us felt charged with something I couldn't name but definitely recognized. His gray eyes had darkened to the color of storm clouds, intense and searching. "You speak about him with such certainty, like you genuinely believe every word. How do you do that?" "Because it's the truth," I said simply. "There's nothing to doubt." The air between us thickened, becoming almost tangible. I could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and bergamot, that probably had a pretentious French name. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, asking a question he hadn't yet voiced. "Tell me to stop," Dawson whispered, leaning closer with agonizing slowness. "Tell me this crosses a line and I'll never mention it again. I'll pretend this moment never happened and we'll go back to being employer and employee. Just say the word." I should have said it, should have established boundaries and maintained professionalism and protected myself from the inevitable complications. Instead, I stayed silent, and when his lips finally met mine, it felt less like a choice and more like inevitability. The kiss was desperate and searching, like he'd been holding his breath underwater for months and I was the first gulp of air. I kissed him back because pretending I didn't want this seemed pointless. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair, and I made a sound that should have embarrassed me but didn't. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the darkness. "I can't offer you simplicity," Dawson said, voice rough. "My life is complicated. I have a son who needs specialized care, a company that demands constant attention, and emotional baggage that could fill multiple storage units. This won't be easy." "I'm not looking for easy," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I'm looking for real." And this, whatever this is, feels more real than anything I've experienced before. He kissed me again, slower this time, thorough and deliberate. When I left his apartment hours later, still tasting him on my lips and feeling the phantom touch of his hands on my skin, I knew there was no returning to what we'd been before. We'd crossed a threshold, and the only direction left was forward. The following weeks existed in a beautiful state of suspended reality where Dawson and I navigated this new dimension of our relationship with careful discretion. Around Allan, we remained exactly as we'd always been. Friendly, comfortable, appropriate, but after the boy fell asleep, we'd gravitate toward each other like planets caught in orbit, spending hours on the couch talking about everything that mattered and nothing at all. Dawson told me about building his empire from absolutely nothing, starting with a single property renovation when he was barely old enough to rent a car. He described the skepticism he'd faced from established developers who saw him as an upstart kid playing at being a businessman, and the satisfaction of proving every doubter wrong. But he also talked about how Allan's diagnosis had fundamentally reorganized his priorities, forcing him to recognize that success measured in square footage and profit margins meant nothing if he wasn't present for his son. I shared my own story growing up in a household where love was abundant but money was perpetually scarce, where my parents worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat but still found time for family dinners around our cramped kitchen table. I told him about my dreams of becoming a museum curator, of spending my days surrounded by art and history, preserving beauty for future generations. Our backgrounds couldn't have been more different, yet somehow we found common ground in the spaces between our words. Then came the charity gala, and everything became infinitely more complicated. Dawson's company was hosting an event focused on funding programs for children with special needs, and he invited me to attend as Allan's companion, a deliberately vague title that could mean everything or nothing depending on interpretation. When he had a tailored suit delivered to my apartment, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined, I realized he was serious about making me fit into his world. The gala was everything I'd feared, a glittering display of wealth and social performance held in a ballroom that looked like it belonged in a European palace. Crystal chandeliers refracted light into rainbow patterns across marble floors. Women wore gowns that cost semesters' worth of tuition, dripping with jewelry that could fund small nations. Conversations flowed around me, superficial and performative, everyone performing their assigned roles in this theater of affluence. I stood beside Dawson, nursing a glass of champagne I was too nervous to actually drink. When a woman approached us, she was objectively beautiful in the way that required professional maintenance, perfect hair, flawless makeup, a designer dress that hugged her figure like it had been sewn directly onto her body. But her eyes were calculating and cold, assessing me like I was an interesting specimen in a laboratory. "Dawson," she said, her voice sweet enough to cause cavities, "what an unexpected surprise seeing you here with a companion." Dawson's entire body went rigid beside me. "Anna." My stomach performed an uncomfortable flip. This was Allan's mother, the woman who'd abandoned her child because his neurodivergence didn't fit her perfect life plan. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, her smile sharpening into something predatory. "Who's your friend? New personal assistant?" "He's Allan's companion," Dawson said tightly, jaw clenched so hard I worried he'd crack a tooth. "And someone who's become important to our family." "How convenient," Anna replied with mock sympathy. "Tell me, does your new friend understand what he's gotten himself into? Does he know that you're incapable of emotional availability, that you prioritize your son above everything else, including adult relationships?" "That's enough," Dawson warned, voice dropping to a dangerous register I'd never heard before. But Anna wasn't finished. She stepped closer, ignoring me entirely now, focusing all her venom on Dawson. "I've been consulting with my attorney. Allan is legally my son too, regardless of how inconvenient that might be for your current situation. I'm filing to revisit custody arrangements." The color drained from Dawson's face. "You abandoned him." "I was overwhelmed and needed space," Anna countered smoothly. "But I've had time to reflect and grow. Any judge will see that a child deserves access to both parents, not just a father who's so obsessed with his son's condition that he's isolated him from normal social experiences." She walked away before either of us could respond, leaving behind tension so thick it felt suffocating. Dawson stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides, breathing hard through his nose. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and meaningless conversations, while Dawson's mind was clearly miles away, spinning through worst-case scenarios. Back at the penthouse, he immediately called his lawyer despite the late hour, pacing his office while discussing legal strategies in clipped, professional tones that couldn't quite hide his underlying panic. I hovered in the living room, feeling useless and out of my depth, wishing I knew how to help. When he finally emerged, he looked defeated in a way I'd never seen before. "She can't take him," he whispered, more to himself than me. "She doesn't get to walk away and then decide she wants back in when it's convenient. She doesn't have that right." I crossed the room and took his face in my hands, forcing him to focus on me instead of spiraling into catastrophic thinking. "We'll fight this. Together. I'm not going anywhere, Dawson. Whatever happens, we face it as a team." His eyes searched mine, looking for certainty in the midst of chaos. Then he pulled me into his arms, holding on like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against my hair. "Yes, you do," I said firmly. "You and Allan both deserve stability, happiness, and someone who chooses to stay. I'm choosing to stay." That night, we made an unspoken promise to each other. This battle wasn't just his anymore, it was ours. Whatever came next, we'd face it standing together. The next 3 months tested every assumption I'd ever made about my own strength and resilience. Anna's custody petition turned into a full-scale legal war, complete with aggressive attorneys, court dates, and character assessments that felt more like interrogations. Her lawyer painted Dawson as an obsessive father who'd isolated Allan from normal childhood experiences, and me as an unqualified interloper with suspicious motivations for inserting myself into a vulnerable child's life. Court hearings became a regular nightmare. I'd sit in the gallery watching Dawson on the witness stand, being cross-examined about his parenting decisions with the kind of hostile scrutiny usually reserved for criminal defendants. They questioned everything: his work schedule, Allan's therapy regimen, the appropriateness of hiring me despite my lack of formal credentials. Allan's medical records were discussed in clinical detail, his struggles laid bare for strangers to judge. The worst part was seeing how the stress affected Allan. He couldn't understand the legal complexities, but he sensed something was wrong. He became clingy, following me from room to room whenever I visited as if afraid I might disappear like his mother had. His meltdowns increased in frequency and my heart broke watching him regress into behaviors he'd worked so hard to overcome. One evening, Dawson came home late from a particularly brutal strategy session with his legal team. He looked completely defeated, dark circles under his eyes, suit wrinkled from hours of tension. I made a decision then. I couldn't just be a supportive presence anymore. I needed to actively help. I contacted Allan's therapist, Dr. Morrison, and asked if she'd be willing to testify about the positive impact of my involvement in Allan's life. To my surprise, she agreed immediately. "I've been documenting his progress," she explained. "The improvement since you entered his life has been remarkable. The court should know that." I also reached out to Professor Chen from my university, who specialized in child psychology. She helped me prepare for the possibility of being called to testify, coaching me on how to present my relationship with Allan in clinical terms that would resonate with a judge. Her confidence in me provided strength I didn't know I needed. The final hearing arrived with the weight of inevitability. The courtroom was intimidating, all wood paneling and formal procedures, everyone speaking in legal language that felt designed to obscure rather than clarify. Anna sat across the aisle looking polished and confident, her expensive lawyer radiating aggressive competence. Dawson gripped my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers, but I didn't pull away. Dr. Morrison testified first, presenting documented evidence of Allan's developmental progress. She explained how stable, consistent relationships were crucial for children with sensory processing disorders, and how disrupting Allan's current environment could cause significant psychological harm. Anna's lawyer tried to undermine her testimony, but Dr. Morrison remained unshakable, her professional authority impossible to dismiss. Then I was called to the stand. Walking to that witness chair felt like moving through water. every step requiring conscious effort. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and forced myself to make eye contact with the judge instead of focusing on the dozens of eyes watching me. Anna's lawyer approached with predatory confidence. Mr. Brennan, you're currently a college student with no formal training in childcare or special education, correct? That's correct. And you were hired by Mr. Quentin despite these lack of qualifications because Allan and I connected after I helped him during the museum fire. Mr. Quentin recognized that sometimes what a child needs isn't credentials, it's genuine care and understanding. The lawyer's smile was patronizing. How noble, but surely you can see why some might question whether a college student can provide adequate support for a child with complex medical needs. I took a breath, remembering Professor Chen's coaching. Allan doesn't need someone to fix him because there's nothing broken about him. He needs people who see his strengths instead of just his challenges. He needs consistency and patience in someone who shows up reliably. I may not have a degree in child psychology, but I offer him something equally valuable: unconditional acceptance and genuine friendship. And what can you possibly offer this child beyond temporary companionship? You have no financial stability, no permanent career prospects, no long-term plan for your involvement in his life. I offer him what every child deserves, I said firmly. Love, patience, and someone who chooses to stay even when things get difficult. Those aren't things you can measure with qualifications or financial statements. The judge listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When both sides rested their cases, she announced she'd issue her decision within a week. Those 7 days felt longer than the previous 3 months combined. Finally, the verdict arrived. The judge granted Anna limited supervised visitation but maintained primary custody with Dawson. She stated clearly that Allan's current environment was stable and beneficial, and that significant disruption could cause psychological harm outweighing any potential benefits of increased maternal contact. Dawson collapsed against me outside the courtroom, actually crying in public without caring who witnessed his vulnerability. We did it, he kept repeating. We actually did it. That night, after the babysitter left and Allan was safely asleep, Dawson took my hand and led me to his bedroom. The air felt charged with significance as he turned to face me, nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. Move in with us, he said. Not as Allan's companion or an employee, but as my partner. As someone who belongs here permanently, who's part of this family not because of a job contract, but because we choose each other. My heart was racing, but my answer came without hesitation. Yes. I want this. I want you both. This life we're building together. He kissed me then, and it felt different from every kiss before. Like a promise, a commitment, a future unfolding before us. We checked on Allan together, watching him sleep peacefully, and Dawson squeezed my hand. Thank you, he whispered, for saving him during the fire and for saving both of us every day since. I kissed his forehead and realized something profound. They'd saved me too. They'd given me purpose, family, and finally a place I truly belonged. After years of searching, I'd found my home.